Hi everyone, I got cut off from the last part of our discussion of the Puritan settlements in the New England region. So the Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island region were settled by religious separatists from England. They got into conflict with England, they got into conflict with each other, mostly over religious beliefs, but to some extent political as well, and they will be involved in conflicts with the Native Americans. So this part is to finish up everything with the New England region, and here I'm talking about their relations with the Native Americans. There are two big wars in the 17th century. The first one is the Pequot War, and it was fought between Native American tribes over beaver trade with the New England region and the New Englanders in the Boston region and in the Connecticut and Rhode Island region. That war again was fought between Native Americans, and the English settlers in the New England region came in on the side of the Narragansett, actually, but you don't need to really remember that, but know that the Pequot War was about beaver trade, right? Commerce. In addition, in relations with the Native Americans, the New Englanders did set up praying towns. Now this is unusual for the English settlements. Remember that the Spanish settlements will convert Native Americans to Catholicism, and they did that in a big way throughout the Latin Americas. The English tended to settle separately and not engage in conversion of Native Americans necessarily. Even the Puritans and the Pilgrims in the New England region didn't tend to, but they did one thing. They did set up what were called praying towns, and that was a place where Native Americans could come and they could become Christians in these praying towns, and then they could be integrated into the New England population, was the idea behind the praying towns. But they got education in praying towns, and that's why we have some that had educations from the New Englanders who fought actually in King Philip's War. King Philip's War was fought by a Native American tribal chief, Metacoma, and Metacoma partly he attacked the New England region, the Bostonian region, because 3 of his tribesmen were arrested and tried by the New Englanders for having murdered Sassamon. And Sassamon was a Native American liaison between the Bostonians and Metacoma. He had been educated all the way up and had been educated in Harvard, but he was a Native American. And he got murdered by some Native Americans, 3 Native Americans that the Bostonians went and hunted down. They arrested them, they put them on trial, and they executed them. And so the attacks made in King Philip's War were in retaliation for the execution of those 3 Native Americans who were found guilty of, and I don't know how solid the case was, but they were found guilty of having murdered Sassamon by the New Englanders. So Metacoma and his tribe, and other tribes actually outside of just his tribe, were engaged in raids on the English villages around the Bostonian region. And that's when the Bostonian got together a militia to defend their villages, and they fought. And this was called King Philip's War, and you can see it's in 1675. And they fought and defeated the Native Americans, and the net effect was to push the Native Americans, just like in the Chesapeake. They pushed them further west. Here, too, they pushed them further west as the population was growing. So you can see that this war, whatever its immediate origins were, the murder of Sassamon and sort of the spark of war came from that, but there was also pressure on land. And as the Bostonian settlement grew in population, and it grew very quickly to over 40,000, so now these New England settlers were moving out to the outer reaches, and so that is usually considered part of the reason for King Philip's War, land pressure. Okay, so the natives were defeated and pushed further west. And those are the two big wars in the 17th century that were fought in the Bostonian region. And you should know that that's, a good contrast with the Chesapeake, which I know you guys will be doing in your writing assignment. All right, some other colonies very quickly that were established in the middle colonies and the establishment after the restoration of the Stuart kings. Pennsylvania was one. A debt was owed to William Penn by the king, and the king said, you can have as much land as you can get starting in Philadelphia and going west for 3 days. So this tale is that William Penn sent out a man to run as far as he could west in 3 days, and that would be the establishment of William Penn's territory to repay a debt that the king owed him. So that was all established by a debt, or established because of a debt owed to King James II, owed by King James II to William Penn. I'm sorry, I'm Charles II, not James II. William Penn himself was a Quaker, and so he established the colony for Quakers, or at least the Quakers were very welcome in his Pennsylvania, as it became known by his name. And Sylvania is a term used that means woods, right? The Quakers is a name that comes because as they practice their religion, they all come into a communal building, and there's nobody leading the Quakers, but all the adherents to the Quaker religion come, they sit down, and when divine presence has touched you, you get up and speak about it. And then sometimes that was people would shake or quake, and they were called Quakers. Their own name for themselves was the Society of Friends, and they were a very tolerant, egalitarian religious sect. And that's very important because Pennsylvania then becomes one of the most tolerant and egalitarian colonies of the English. Right? So it's very strikingly similar. In fact, they will be the first ones to have a Charter of Liberties, so laws that guarantee freedoms of the people in their community. When they build government, they'll build the most radical democratic government of all the colonies, and they will include broadly people into the citizenry in the colonies. And so Pennsylvania is one of those colonies that even had blacks as citizens and voting citizens early on. New York is established in 1664 by James II, who is the Duke of York, and it is bought from the Dutch. The Dutch originally settled New Amsterdam, is what it was called by the Dutch, and they settled that in 1609, at about the same time that the Chesapeake and Jamestown settlement was put down. The Dutch moved in. They had a very wealthy class of landowners along the Hudson River, and then in 1664, after wars with the English, the Dutch found it in their interest to sell New York to the English, and so they would sell it, and then English people would show up. So the distinctive feature of the New York colony becomes a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious community in New York, and a big commercial entrepot. Finally, Georgia is also settled, and you can see this is much later in 1731, so in the 18th century. And then it's distinctive because it is settled by debtors, usually people who were put into prison because they were in debt. And even in England, they were finding that that was not an effective way to get rid of debt. If you imprison the person who owes the debt, he doesn't really have a way of earning to pay that debt. So one of the things they did was allow for these people in debtor's prison to go to this new colony that was called Georgia. And there are other stories with the other colonies, the Carolinas, of course, and Delaware and New Jersey, etc. But we'll leave it at that. The last thing on this New England lecture is that the Dominion of New England is formed in the late part of the 17th century. And this is a political body which is, the territory of which is going to be Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The Dominion is formed in 1685, and the point of it is for the king and the parliament that now they're under a broad charter, and the king could put his own governor into the region. And so he had a governor and lieutenant governor that were appointed as the king's eyes and ears and the king's law in the Dominion of New England. So one governor for all the states up in the what we call New England today. And then very quickly in 1688, a glorious revolution breaks out in England. It was called glorious, or actually bloodless, revolution because there was very little fighting, although there was some, and they overthrew the sitting king in England. And so in England, that was what the glorious revolution was. But it had ripples out into the colonies. And in the New England region, this Dominion of New England, they would overthrow the governor and the lieutenant governor that were set up. The governor was in Boston. His name was Andros. They imprisoned him during this period. And in New York, where the lieutenant governor sat, they overthrew him. The lieutenant governor's name was Nicholas, and a temporary government was set up by a guy named Jacob Leisler. And so the overthrow of Nicholas was Lieutenant Governor Nicholas was always called the Leisler Rebellion. All right, so we can see that the New England region is a very contentious area. It's got these religious separatists from England at first. They quarrel amongst themselves. They divide the region up into different political units because of those quarrels, most of which were over religion. They have some conflict with the Native Americans. To some extent, they get involved in it, secondhand, that it's a conflict between Native American, and the New Englanders take one side in the Pequot War. And then they do get involved finally as the population grows and there's land pressure, and then war breaks out with Metacoma in what's known as King Philip's War. So it's a pretty tense region, mostly for religious reasons. All right, so New England, lots of religious zeal brought these people. It made them successful. Don't forget John Winthrop's speech. We're all here together in this. It's very communal, right? And that's what's interesting about Winthrop, is that he talks communally. And yet these people show that they have very independent spirits as they come into conflict with each other, and they're willing to establish new colonies. We see some evidence of broad-based electoral votes. Connecticut is one of those things, large tolerance in places like Rhode Island or even down into Pennsylvania. Right? New England's the region where we get town halls growing up. And then an independent governor, at least at first. And then he's made the king's representative in New England when it becomes the Dominion of New England. All right? So that's the end of my lecture on New England. I'm sorry about the interruption with coffee. I couldn't put this off any longer. Anyways. There you go. That's New England versus the Chesapeake.